Excellencies, ambassadors, representatives of the diplomatic corps in Canberra, colleagues, students, friends, family, good evening. My name is Erik Lithander. I am the Pro Vice-Chancellor and Vice President for International and Outreach Affairs at ANU. And on behalf of myself and Dr. Eugenia de Muro, the Acting Director of the Australian National Centre for Latin American Studies, which has organised this event, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's book launch. As always, we begin this event by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet this evening. And we pay our respect to the elders of the Ngunnawal people, past and present. The American comedian Groucho Marx once famously said, "I would not want to belong to any club that will accept people like me as a member." And my personal adaptation of that quote is, I would not want to attend an event where someone like me has been asked to give a speech. Tonight's event, however, is very different and is one that I and many of my colleagues at ANU have been looking forward to with great anticipation. We're here tonight to celebrate the launch of the English language translation of El Apocalipsis según Benedicto by Esteban Bedoya. Esteban will be known to many of you in many different ways. To some of you, you'll know him through his writing. Many of you will know him through his day job, which is as the Chief of Mission of the Embassy of Paraguay in Canberra. But all of us know him as a friend, as an intellectual, and a very warm and engaging human being. From the perspective of the Australian National University, we're absolutely delighted to be able to host this book launch and the events this evening, and for a multitude of reasons. Esteban is a good friend of the university, both through his engagement as part of the Latin American Diplomatic Corps in Canberra, which we have the great pleasure of engaging with on a regular basis, both through the Australian National Centre of Latin American Studies, but also through other fora. We're of course extremely conscious of the university's contribution and responsibility to the cultural life of Canberra, and more broadly to Australia as a whole. And hosting events such as the one tonight is an important part of that contribution. And finally, on a purely personal level, my own academic background is in Latin American literature, so I'm here in equal measure as a representative of the university, but also as a private citizen with a passion for Latin American literature. So thank you, Esteban, for giving us this opportunity to celebrate with you the launch of your book. Esteban was born in Asunción, Paraguay in 1958, but he moved to Argentina at a young age with his family. It was during this time as a youngster in Buenos Aires that Esteban began participating in literary workshops, from which many of his earlier works were formed. Esteban has spoken about the fact that during his youth, he was actually initially more interested in drawing, and turned to writing partially to compensate for some of the shortcomings in drawing as a mechanism for expressing his ideas and his interests. However, he was also actively involved in the support of Paraguayan exiles in Argentina who had fled the military regime under Alfredo Stroessner. In interviews, Esteban has indicated that this involvement was one of the reasons why he did not devote himself wholeheartedly to literature in those early days. However, the writing that he did find the time to create was soon noticed, and he won a number of literary awards in Argentina, including one from the Latin American Association of Poets in 1982. Esteban was educated in Buenos Aires and he qualified as an architect. In his case, the discipline of architecture was not at all incompatible with literary creation. The Russian novelist and playwright Evgeny Zamatin once proposed a definition of literature where literature is defined as a combination of three things: painting, architecture, and music. I happen to know that music is important to Esteban, both as a source of relaxation and for inspiration in his writing. So according to Zamatin's definition, his combination of his skills in drawing, his experience in architecture, and his interest for music set the scene nicely for further literary production. Having worked for a number of years as an architect, Esteban returned to Paraguay following the end of the Stroessner regime in 1989, and he joined the Paraguayan Foreign Service. a posting to Switzerland preceded his posting as head of mission of the Embassy of Paraguay in Canberra, a position that he's held since 2011. Esteban's books have been translated into English, French, Italian, and German. The original Spanish language version of the book that we're launching tonight, The Apocalypse According to Benedict, won the prestigious PEN Lily Tuck Award for Paraguayan Literature in 2010. I read an interview that when he first began working on The Apocalypse According to Benedict, Esteban was considering writing a much longer work, possibly a full-length novel. But after some soul-searching and some very careful consideration, he decided that he needed above all to preserve his words, to be economical, to, as he called it, administer his words appropriately. The result, which I think is evident in the book, is a wonderful discipline with the use of language. And this concept of economy of language is one that resonates very clearly with me at a personal level, because the Latin American writer whose works I studied in my PhD, which was at the University of Cambridge, Julio Cortázar from Argentina, was influenced by the great Jorge Luis Borges. And Cortázar was very clearly of the belief that what keeps great writers awake at night is not the dilemma about which words to include in the text, but rather the dilemma of which words to exclude from the text. In other words, less is more. I'm sure that our next speaker will tell us a little bit more about Esteban's writing style. I'll finish by saying that in the same interview that I read, Esteban mentions that the greatest single lesson that he learned from some of those early literary workshops in Buenos Aires was the lesson of patience. Patience not to rush an idea, not to rush the language, and not to rush the process of writing. And having the discipline to abide by these rules of patience requires an incredible command of the art and of the art form. And those of you who have already had the opportunity to read some of Esteban's work will agree with me that he does have a wonderful command not only of ideas, but also of the language that he uses to express those ideas. Now, while Esteban himself might have mastered patience, I don't necessarily expect all of you to have done so, particularly when I'm standing between you and a glass of wine. So I will now pass you over to Professor Roy Boland, who translated the Apocalypse According to Benedict into English. Professor Boland is Honorary Professor of Spanish and Latin American Studies at the University of Sydney. He is the author of a number of significant studies of Latin American literature, and he's the general editor of Antípodas, the Journal of Hispanic and Galician Studies of Australia and New Zealand. In 2009, Roy was awarded the Cross of the Order of Isabel la Católica by the King of Spain for his contributions to Hispanic studies. Roy.
Primero una palabra en español, agradecer la presencia de sus excelencias. Muchas gracias por asistir. Now, I have been asked to deliver the talk in English, which I shall do so. Now, I have an advantage over you. I have read the novel in English and in Spanish, so I will be very judicious in my references to the novel. So I will just try to whet your appetite, and hopefully you will buy it and read it in Spanish or in English. Now, I would like to thank, before I continue, the Australian National Centre for Latin American Studies for inviting me, and I would like to extend particular thanks to Mr. Esteban Bedoya and PEN American International for giving me the opportunity to translate this very witty, inventive, in some ways scandalous, but very persuasive book of stories. So persuasive, persuasivo en español, so persuasive that since I read the title story, El Apocalipsis según Benedicto, the Apocalypse According to Benedict, since I've read the story, whenever I see the real flesh and blood, now Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, I can't help but identify him with the fictional Pope of Esteban Bedoya's story. And when Benedict appears on television, next to him, I can't help it, next to him I always see, next to him, Sister Pascualina of the novel, of the novella, the little Mexican nun in love with Benedict. In his book, Letters to a Young Novelist, Cartas a un Joven Novelista, Mario Vargas Llosa as acute a critic as he is a master storyteller, comments that a story will not be successful with its readers unless the writer, the novelist, the author, unless the author endows the story with el poder de la persuasión, the power of persuasion. The Apocalypse, according to Benedict and other stories, certainly has this power of persuasion. Now, when I was invited to speak at this book launch, I wasn't sure whether I should do so as a translator, which I am, the translator of the book, or in my professional role as a literary critic. My dilemma was resolved by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who, in a very famous lecture, defined translation as the best kind of reading. And he goes on to describe translation, which he himself has practiced, as the most difficult, least recognized, and worst paid kind of reading. Now, I only agree in part with Garcia Marquez's description. As I have experienced and practiced it, I regard translation as a privilege, and yes, very difficult reading of words, phrases, symbols, structures, rhythms, and accents, whose secret meaning, implications, or reverberations a translator gets to know better than most other readers. So I decided to concentrate on my job as a translation of this wonderful book by Esteban Bedoya. And there are many theories about translation, most of them, by the way, contradictory, but they all seem to agree on one fact, that translation is not just about words. If it were just about words, translation would not be difficult at all. All I would have to do as a translator would be to do a word-for-word translation. That is, I'll try to explain this, all I would have to do would be to transpose English vocabulary onto the grammar of Spanish, and presto. There, in no time at all, you would have in your hands a literal translation entitled The Apocalypse According to Benedict and Other Stories. However, if I tried this method, a very easy method with good dictionaries and Google and so forth, if I tried this method, this would be a very rude, very awkward, very unsatisfactory translation, written in a sort of broken or pidgin English, of the type that you find on the internet when you log on to one of those crowdsourcing translation sites. Such a translation, I think you call them crowdsourcing translation services or sites. You could easily do that, but it doesn't work. Such a translation would do an injustice to Esteban Bedoya's beautifully crafted Spanish original. A beautifully written Spanish text about a revolutionary pope who loves Munster cheese, a nun who feeds him red hot chili peppers. Use your imagination why she feeds him red hot chili peppers. And in this wonderfully written book, there's also other characters. There are ghosts, there are murderers, there are torturers, there are all sorts of wonderfully colourful characters. No, I think I have to say no. A translation, and certainly a literary translation, is more than just about finding verbal equivalents in English, the target language, for the words in Spanish, the source language. Borges, possibly the greatest and most influential writer in Spanish in the second half of the 20th century, and a translator himself from English to Spanish, described translation, in his own words in English, as a problem consubstantial, he speaks better English than I do. He described translation as a problem consubstantial to literature, un problema consustancial a la literatura. Without meaning to bore you, I shall outline some of the problems confronting the translator, including this translator. Firstly, how to reconcile the objectives of fidelity and readability. That is, how to remain as faithful as possible to the original text in the source language and to produce a text that reads persuasively in the target language. In my particular case, this means remaining true to Esteban Bedoya's text and the cultural context of his stories, while at the same time giving the impression of fooling you, the readers, that Esteban Bedoya has actually written the translation originally in English. How do you do that? I have to give the impression that this is not a translation, but in fact, a book written in English by Esteban Bedoya. Now, how do I render into fluent English paragraphs composed in Spanish? The book that you read, El Apocalipsis según Benedicto, is a book composed in Spanish, but this book expresses thoughts and dialogues of characters who, in Esteban Bedoya's stories, think and talk in a variety of languages and dialects. A lot of the characters in this book do not speak Spanish as a first language, neither do they speak English. They in fact speak a variety of regional Spanish and other languages, Paraguayan Spanish for obvious reasons, Argentinian Spanish, because some of the stories are set partly in Argentina. There is Mexican Spanish. The little nun who's in love with Benedict is Mexican. Benedict himself is German. So you're reading in Spanish or in English, but he's talking or thinking in German. In another story, the character might be talking in Spanish, or in fact, he might be talking and thinking in Swiss German. And there's also some Italian. Now, for example, in my translation, I had to find the right tone and register in English for Pope Benedict, whose German and Italian are conveyed in Esteban's original Spanish text in a very stilted, grandiloquent way, because as you know, Benedict speaks in a very stilted, dry, grandiloquent way. Now, as a translator, one must also convey or transfer mental content. It's not just about words. Mental content, ideas, impressions, private psychology, collective attitudes, notions of national identity, and cultural values. Ultimately, the translator has to make a choice between moving the reader towards the writer and the original text, or moving the writer and the original text towards the reader. Just think about that for a minute, and you will realize why, in translating the Apocalypse according to Benedict and other stories, I have chosen to move the reader towards the writer. That is, I have tried to accommodate and assimilate into fluent, native speaker, and native reader English the foreignness, the otherness, the idiosyncratic style, values, feelings, and expressions of Esteban Bedoya's Spanish language, the stories it tells, and the zeitgeist, the worldview, the spirit it conveys. So you see, from my brief exposition, that you can see that what Garcia Marquez means, you can see what he means when Garcia Marquez says that translation is very difficult. It's not easy. Yet sometimes it is the apparently most trivial aspects of translation that cause the greatest headaches. Let me give you a couple of examples from my translation of the Apocalypse according to Benedict. Now, in principle, a translator should have an extremely high level of competence. In principle, in theory, an extremely high level of competence in the two languages involved. In this case, Spanish and English. But linguistic competence is not enough. A translator should also have a deep, sympathetic awareness, if not knowledge, of the culture of the language into which he or she is translating. But culture is a very wide concept. It encompasses everything from history, politics, anthropology, etc., to music, art, soap operas, and food. Now, I love food, including Paraguayan food, but I am not a cook. I like eating. And I am not sure when I eat, I'm not sure of the ingredients used in making the typical Paraguayan or Argentinian dishes mentioned in Esteban Bedoya's book. One of these delicacies is a well-known dessert called dulce de leche. A literal translation would be candy of milk, or candied milk, or milk candy. Now, I have tasted dulce de leche on numerous occasions, and in my first draft of the translation, I translated the expression dulce de leche as candy of milk. I looked it up, I found it in a couple of recipe books, and I thought, well, that must be it. However, when my wife Margarita, who is an expert cook, read my draft, she queried the English translation candy of milk. When I explained that it was my translation of dulce de leche, she clarified that in fact this was caramel in English, or caramel paste, which is what Mr. Bedoya, his family and many Paraguayans spread on their bread at breakfast. I've been to his house for breakfast, then I remembered, yes, they spread their dulce de leche on the bread. I just forgot it when I was translating. So, in my translation of the second story, the González Espino family, you will read that a mother is trying desperately to fatten her little boy by feeding him bread spread with caramel. That's how I translated it. And I went to a lot of trouble. I had to consult with my wife, dictionary, what have you. Now, this may or may not be the best translation, but imagine my surprise and frustration when only last week, after the English translation had gone to press, I read a review by Peter Durack in the Sydney Morning Herald in which he lauded the dulce de leche. He didn't say candy of milk or anything. He just said, a magnificent dulce de leche served in a cafe in Sydney. Apparently, dulce de leche is now part of the gastronomic vocabulary in English and requires no translation. That shows you how a trivial matter like that can just drive you mad. Now, here I could be wrong again. A peculiar term appears in the González Espino family. This is a fantastic political tale with homoerotic overtones set in Argentina during the last military dictatorship. The term I'm referring to is cabecitas negras, right? Cabecitas negras, little blackheads, literally. Now, a literal translation of the phrase in which this term appears is, he and his brothers arrived in Buenos Aires in the midst of an invasion of little blackheads. And this particular story, la familia, the González Espino family, this particular story, which you will read, is full of black humor. And since the brothers arriving in Buenos Aires in the story were adolescents, very young men, my first reading was that the boys arrived in Buenos Aires with their faces covered in blackheads, in little blackheads. I had blackheads, and adolescents, we all get blackheads, so I thought, no, just black humor, adolescents. But as I have told you, I have mentioned earlier, one should be wary of literal translations. So after consulting a history book, I learned that cabecitas negras, and I hope the history book is right, I learned that cabecitas negras is a derogatory racist term in Argentina for the dark-skinned peasants who flooded from the provinces to the capital during a time of economic crisis. Needless to say, I very quickly changed my translation. The translation poses many pitfalls for the unwary and for the ignorant, and I was both. And I might still be. I hope the Argentinian ambassador won't tell me I got it wrong. I shall give you one more illustration of the dilemmas that I face in translating the Apocalypse and other stories. The final, I hope nobody will be offended, but you can blame the author. So one of the things about this is very clear, economical Spanish of different registers, y como se dice en español, no tiene pelos en la lengua. Dice, ¿no? In other words, if a character speaks like a wolfie or like a footballer or like a foul-mouthed cad, that's what you will get in the book, right? It's honesty of language. Now, the final sentence of the book, from an enigmatic Gothic ghost story called Villa Eloisa, in English and in Spanish, Villa Eloisa, this is the final sentence of the book from this story is very vulgar, very crude. When the protagonist realizes that he has been swindled in Paraguay of $100,000 in a land deal by a man called Camacho, the protagonist exclaims when he realizes, Camacho me cagó. Right? Now, literally, in English, this is Camacho shat on me. Now, I have spent much time in LA, New York. I have heard and read such an expletive in English in many parts of the USA, and I consulted an urban dictionary, and apparently this common street talk in Chicago and LA, and I gather from some consultation that this expression is also heard in certain quarters in Sydney. But I ask myself, is this expression, he shat on me, is this in common usage in English, in the English-speaking world? Frankly, I'm not sure. My linguistic competence does not extend that far. So after consulting with a variety of native speakers of different ages and backgrounds, I opted instead for that shit Camacho has made a fool of me. Other variants that I considered were Camacho the bastard has screwed me. Another possibility, that turd Camacho has done me over, and other more crude ones, which I won't mention. Now, the point I'm trying to make, translating is not just a matter of translating words. You have to take many things into consideration, including the sensibilities of your readers. So the questions, before I lose my pages, the questions that I mulled over in making my ultimate choice, how to translate Camacho me cagó, was, what kind of reader is this translation aimed at? What register, what degree of vulgarity is most appropriate for this story? How graphic or dramatic should I make the last words of this book? Have I made the right choice? That shit Camacho made a fool of me? Ultimately, you, the reader, will have to judge whether I have made the right choice in my translation. I actually don't think I have, by the way. I've changed my mind, but never mind. Now, for the second, and I will shorten the address if it goes too long. Now, for the second part of my address, how do you evaluate the quality of a translation? That is, whether a translation is good, bad, excellent, or mediocre. Personally, I believe that a literary, that is a translation of a novel, of a poem, that a literary translation, let's say Don Quixote, Madame Bovary, War and Peace, or The Magic Mountain, I believe that the translation should be assessed on its own merits as a work of literature. But unfortunately, this is not the case. It is almost impossible for a bilingual reader to judge it on its own merits, because for a bilingual reader, the translation is a recreation. I stress the una recreación. It's a recreation in a different language of a creation in the original language. La recreación, the recreation in English, the creations in Spanish. Therefore, usually to the embarrassment of a translator, the recreation is rated or assessed against the original, which may be written by a master wordsmith or storyteller like Cervantes, Flaubert, Tolstoy, or Thomas Mann. And with very rare exceptions, like the bilingual Borges or Carlos Fuentes, most translators are not creators. I am not a creator. I am not a creative artist, and most translators aren't, with very rare exceptions. At best, translators like me may be described as using a term coined by Borges. We might be at best a creative recreator, or a man called Roman Jakobson, who's written a lot about translation, says, no, a translator could be a creative approximator. So we are at best recreators or approximators. Now, how creative can a translator be? That is, how much license can a translator like me take in editing, altering, cutting, adding, or experimenting with an original text? Now, I don't know how many of you have heard this story, but the most audacious, most daring translator in the Hispanic world is, or was, Pablo Neruda, the great Chilean poet who won the Nobel Award in Literature in 1971. In 1970, Neruda translated a poem into Spanish by the Bulgarian poet that most of us haven't read. I have only read him originally, but he translated a poem into Spanish by the Bulgarian poet Geo Milev, a revolutionary who was assassinated by fascists in 1925 in Bulgaria. The title of the poem in Spanish is Septiembre, by Neruda without the P. Septiembre, September in English. Now, the curious aspect of Neruda's translation of Milev's poem is that Neruda did not speak more than 1 or 2 words of Bulgarian. Yet, if you read the poem and you look it up, it will say Pablo Neruda, translator. What Neruda did was to ask Bulgarian friends to translate Milev's poem, and he, Neruda, then transformed this rudimentary translation into a wonderful, powerful, graphic Spanish poem. Can you really call Neruda's version of September a translation? I doubt it. It is really an original creation in Spanish, inspired by and based on Geo Milev's Bulgarian poem. The paradox is that Neruda always referred to this poem as a translation. Now, I'm not Borges or Neruda, I'm not any of these writers, but occasionally in translating this book I have chosen to alter, not so much creatively as judiciously, Esteban Bedoya's original Spanish text. I haven't told him that. For example, I have broken long sentences into 2. Why? Because I think English tends to be a more economical language than Spanish, less baroque. I have changed I have changed his passive voice occasionally to active. And I have added, I haven't cut any words, but I have added here and there a word or two to illuminate a particular context or to produce a particular effect. A translator has to think of you, the readers. What is the effect when you read this book in English? Now, for instance, I'll give you an example. In the story entitled Villa Eloísa, Esteban Bedoya writes, Cayó Stroessner. Now, most Latin American readers would know that Stroessner was a dictator in power in Paraguay for more than 3 decades, the second or third longest dictator in Latin American history. But I suspect that many of you here, I would say, I could be wrong, but I would suspect that most English-speaking people in the world would not be familiar with Stroessner. I did a survey at home ringing people up, and most of my friends, educated people, had not heard of Stroessner. So, in my English translator, I made one little change that I think is an important change. Instead of saying Stroessner fell, I say the dictator Stroessner fell. I add the word dictator for clarification. Another example of a judicious change occurs in my English version of the lead story, The Apocalypse According to Benedict, where I had to decide how to translate the Spanish expression Los Dicasterios de la Curia. Los Dicasterios de la Curia. Now, in choosing the best translation, I use myself. I'm a professor of Spanish, I got a PhD, I've done English, history. I use myself as a test case. I was raised a Catholic. I have read Morris's West, The Shoes of the Fisherman. I follow papal elections and the politics of the Vatican. Yet, I did not know, I have to confess, I did not know the meaning of the word dicasterios. I think many of you, I would suspect, don't know it either in Spanish or in English, or maybe I'm wrong. I checked the Catholic Encyclopedia and considered using the term dicasteriums or dicasteria in English, I suppose, but I decided that this was too erudite or esoteric. So I opted for a very simple word that people in Canberra will be acquainted with, departments, in the sense of a section in a government or organisation like the Vatican. That's what dicasterium means, a department in the Vatican. Now, I may or may not have been correct in my choice. Maybe I'm shortchanging the cultural awareness of my readers, I don't know, but I decided to use department. Now, in my mind, and here I will go to the last part, in my mind there is no doubt, absolutely no doubt, a literary translation, including my translation, is always inferior to the original. That's what I believe. But many people disagree with me. Borges disagrees with me. Borges actually believed that a translation could be better than the original. I won't go into that. And other great writers who have been translators themselves disagree with me. For example, Vargas Llosa has said that the translation of La Guerra del Fin del Mundo, the War of the End of the World, is better, mejor, his own word, than the English version. And García Márquez has also stated that the English translation of Cien Años de Soledad, 100 Years of Solitude, is superior to his Spanish original. I don't agree. But now, and I will go on a bit more because only last week I heard an interview with Isabel Allende on the book show on the ABC, in which Isabel Allende declared proudly and enthusiastically in her wonderful English that the just released English translation of her latest novel, Maya's Notebook, is better, that's what she said, better than her Spanish original, El Cuaderno de Maya. Now, I really think we have to take this generous praise by these outrageously talented Latin American writers with a grain of salt. But what the words mean, that la traducción es mejor que mi original, the translation is better than my original, what they're saying is that in their opinion as writers, that they consider that translation is a very important craft. Now, just think about this for a minute. Just think about it, about the importance of translations. Without translations into English, most of us here could not read the Russian masters. We could not read Arabian Nights. We could not read Kafka, Baudelaire, Marx or Freud, or for that matter, the Bible. In fact, no work demonstrates the value, power and influence of translation more than the King James Version of the Bible. As far as I know, I'm not an expert in this area, but I'm reading the Bible bilingually for a project at the moment with Cambridge University Press, and the Bible is a book, it's a translation. It's a book that is a translation from original sources unbeknown to most of us. Most of us don't read Hebrew, we don't read Greek, we don't read Latin and other languages that are the original sources of the Bible. And yet this translation, this Bible, I think that no book, apart from the complete works of Shakespeare, has had a greater influence or impact upon English, the English that we read, that we write or speak in Australia. No other book, apart from Shakespeare, has had as greater an impact upon our English than the Bible, and the Bible is a translation. So you can see that translation is very, very important. And again, I'll go back to Isabel Allende because I'm sure some of you might have heard this. She actually taught me something or made me think of something that I had never realized. In this interview, Isabel Allende explains that it is in fact thanks to the English translation of Maya's Notebook that she, Isabel Allende, will be able to correct in future Spanish editions of her novel some words, phrases or ideas that she now realizes, and I'm quoting her, she says, some of these words that I realize that I use in Spanish are tacky. They're sentimental, and it is thanks to this translation that I will now, when I revise my novel in Spanish for the future, I will change some of these words. Now, the point I want to make here is that whereas a translation is a recreation, it is possible for this recreation to have a retrospective influence upon the creation in the original language. This possibility alone is a validation of the work of the largely invisible, anonymous translator. And I will finish here by telling you again another story, which is relevant to Esteban Bedoya's, my work as translator. In her interview on the book show, Isabel Allende made another significant point, that it is essential for a translator to have some sympathy with the story being translated. Allende's long-standing and brilliant translator, Margaret Sayers Pedden, declined the offer to translate Maya's Notebook because she felt that at the age of 84, she could not relate to a story, Isabel Allende's story about teenagers, drugs, sex, and electronic media. This brings up the final point I would like to bring up about translation, honesty and integrity. A translator should only translate a book he or she feels comfortable with, linguistically, intellectually, culturally, and emotionally. And I accepted the offer to translate the Apocalypse according to Benedict and other stories because I felt quite comfortable with the weird, the wonderful, the violent, the bloody, the shocking, the humorous, and disturbingly entertaining world it portrays. Now, to finish, I want to refer to translation in Australia. Translation is a minor craft in Australia. Commercially, it is too risky for local publishing houses to embark on translation projects. And academically, I think the Vice-Chancellor or Deputy Vice-Chancellor will agree, academically, few universities in Australia recognise translation as an authentic discipline, intellectually or creatively. So most academics, until they get to my age, where promotion doesn't matter, they don't really want to do translations because they're not going to get credit in the universities. And this is why I think PEN American and the Edward and Lily Tuck Foundation should be commended for making it possible for a book by a respected and talented Paraguayan writer to be translated and published in Australia. Paraguay and Australia have few things in common. But one thing I do know they have in common, because I know Paraguay and I know Australia, one thing they have in common is a community of readers avidly interested in reading the best literature that the rest of the world has to offer. Unfortunately, most Paraguayans, including PhDs and doctors and lawyers and graduates, most Paraguayans are not in a position to read Martin Boyd, George Johnston, Judith Wright, Les Murray, or Xavier Herbert. Why? Because very little Australian literature is available in Spanish translation in Paraguay or in the rest of the Spanish-speaking world. Not even in cosmopolitan centres like Madrid, Buenos Aires, Barcelona, Mexico City, Lima, Bogota will you find very much Australian literature in translation. You will find some translations of Patrick White, Thomas Keneally, Maurice West, Bryce Courtenay, Robert Hughes, Kate Morton, the Thornbirds, of course, and not much else. Conversely, Paraguayan literature is almost non-existent in English. Apart from translations of the great Paraguayan novelists, one of his Esteban Bedoya's influences and masters, apart from the works of the great Paraguayan novelist Augusto Roa Bastos, I have not found any other translation of a Paraguayan author in Australia. And you are not likely to find any translations of Paraguayan literature in New York, in LA, or in London. Very little. The truth is, of course, that notable Paraguayan authors like René Ferrer, Josefina Pla, Gabriel Casacha, Eddie Bu, Campos Cervera, and other names, many other names, have yet to be translated into English. Sad, but it's true. Now, I will finish now. George Steiner thinks that one of the motivations for translation may be an attempt to bridge the gap between communities. I very much hope that this translation by this very talented author, this translation by Esteban Bedoya, will help to bring Australia and Paraguay closer together. The Apocalypse, according to Benedict, makes a very significant contribution to Paraguayan and Latin American literature. But just think about it. It is also, this book and also Esteban Bedoya, now part of our Australian literary heritage. This is the first book published published in Australia, the first book written by a Paraguayan published in Australia, and one of the very few books of Paraguayan literature translated into English. That's why I'm very proud to have translated. And if we can talk about the book after you have read it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roy. I think that my next reading of a translated work has just become a much more complicated but also more entertaining affair. Let's go now from the translation to the original. Please, Esteban.
Well, thank you very much, Erik. Roy, I know your translation will improve my original. Thank you in advance. And thank you to the Diplomatic Corps, the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, Ambassador Argentina, dear friends, dear colleagues from the FAT, and thank you to you all for coming. I shall begin by saying a few words about my book, but only a few words because I think this task is best left to readers and critics. Now I have been asked, why write a story about Benedict? I was raised in the bosom of a Catholic family, and I attended Catholic schools, but this did not prevent me from viewing Catholicism with a critical eye. From a very young age, I noticed the contrast between Christian preaching and the pomp and ceremony in the Vatican. As I grew older, I became more and more disappointed. For me, Pope Benedict was an enigma. I perceived him as an arch-conservative, but at the same time as a man who was true to his archaic way of thinking. Ultimately, I saw him as a man who was honest with himself and his belief. Curious, I began to find out as much as I could about Ratzinger. Some of the questions and issues in the book have been hanging over me for years. They go back to the years when I lived in Argentina, discovered a long period of my life, from childhood to adulthood, my vital formative years. My childhood years in Buenos Aires were difficult, but it is from this period that I derived the motivation and creative energy to write. Through my experiences as a traveler, I made new cultural discoveries. But it is in my childhood that I find my vital energy as a writer. My cultural experience in Buenos Aires provided material for the González Espino family, the second story in the book. The time spent in Europe inspired me for the third story, The Internal Path. And my permanent constant connection with Paraguay was the source of Villa Eloísa, the last story in the collection. I have sometimes asked myself whether I am a kind of travel writer. In truth, I'm not sure how to classify myself, but if I draw a parallel between literature and painting, at times I feel I'm a cubist, sometimes a hyperrealist. On occasion I find surrealist traces in myself, and in a very small way I feel something of a Baroque writer. In any case, fiction is a good fit for me. Here, a definition that fit my work. The unreality of fiction is not the fantastic or the improbable, but what is always possible in reality. I find it very satisfying to flirt with fiction, to find myself in the situation where I have to provide explanation to readers about the reality or falsity of my stories. Whenever this happens, I feel a complicity with my readers. I then invite my readers to believe that my fantasy is possible. I think that this belief could bring comfort to my readers, perhaps providing them with an ideal way to escape from everyday routine. Personally, I believe it is a great advantage to believe that through fictions one can find a more tolerable and more bearable place to live. Since creating fictions is in a way linked to searching for utopias, I feel an empathy with the idealistic Australian who, at the end of the 19th century, traveled to the jungle of Paraguay to build an ideal society. These adventurers founded two colonies, New Australia and Cosme. A fascinating feature of this social experiment was its cultural component. The library founded by the colonists consisted of thousands of books, but perhaps the worst aspect of this adventure was what we call in Spanish mestizaje, two cultures coming together, a phenomenon that has produced 4 generations of Paraguayans descended from Australians. It is an interesting story how, by the strange design of fate, Paraguay was chosen by people of different nationalities and culture as a site for the creation of utopian societies. One example is Nueva Germania, a German settlement founded by Bernard Foster, the husband of Elizabeth Foster Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche's sister. Another example is Puerto Bertoni, an enclave in the middle of Paraguayan jungle, established by a Swiss anarchist. This was a scientific utopia headed by a man of wisdom, Josephist, who devoted himself to anthropology, meteorology, ethnobotany, and natural medicine. And there were also the Mennonites, who established themselves in Paraguay in 1929, and who remain there today in the vast, sparsely populated region of the Paraguayan Chaco. In the history of these utopian enterprises, there is one person to whom I feel obliged to pay homage. This is Mary Gilmore, one of the women who arrived with the Australian colonies. She was a gifted poet who labored in the school established in the colony of New Australia in Caazapá. She educated the first generation of Australian children over there in Paraguay. Today, Mary Gilmore is immortalized in the Australian $10 note, which features her face, although very few Australians know the story behind the lady of this blue-collar note. I highlight Mary Gilmore because she embodies the cultural ideals and the values required for the construction of a more equitable society. Finally, I would like to say something about the 4 books I have published so far in my career. I understand that readers find in them a dose of humor, eroticism, and certain lack of inhibition. But I think that they also may be identified to some extent with the work of the Paraguayan writers who have lived in exile. In this regard, my books express how a national literature can reflect the social disruption caused by successive waves of enforced emigration. The strong link between literature and politics is apparent in Paraguayan literature. As Vargas Llosa said, to write is to act through stories. One exercises one's position as a citizen, as a member of a community who has a social and civil obligation to participate in the debate and the solution to the problems of one's society. At this moment, as I'm preparing my 5th book, I feel that I'm entering a new stage as a writer, one in which fundamentally I want to enjoy the act of writing. Nothing more, nothing less. In this regard, my stay in Australia is proving a fruitful experience, as I have almost completed a book with the simple title of Australian Stories. And since I believed in the saying, brevity is the source of wit, I now finish. I would invite you to join the reading of a paragraph or 2 from the Apocalypse according to Benedict. Then I will write first in Spanish, an excerpt, and immediately the Professor Boland will read in English. Ratzinger se alteró, pues creyó estar a solas. Mimetizada en la oscuridad descubrió a la monja como si entre tanta negrura hubiese algo más que la complicidad de lo invisible. Pero ¿qué más da otra violación a su privacidad de parte de Pascualina? Es como si le contara secretos a una mascota, pensó, y de inmediato languideció al recordar la maldición que la Indiana Neglis le lanzó durante la ensoñación. Buenas noches, eminencia. Se despidió sumisamente, consciente del desatino cometido. Ratzinger no tuvo ánimos para responder. Él solo aspiraba a una cuota de tranquilidad que le permitiese disfrutar de sí mismo. Fueron necesarios varios minutos de meditación para olvidar la incómoda situación pasada, hasta que llegó la calma reconfortante que provenía de lo más profundo de la madrugada. Era tiempo de la rutina de sus largos paseos entre el dormitorio y la biblioteca, estaciones de un inalterable y perseverante recorrido. Pero esa noche, la sequedad del aire lo obligó a variar el itinerario y dirigirse al área de servicio en busca de un trago de miel. Encontró la cocina cortada en dos por una franja de luz que nacía de una puerta mal cerrada, claro indicio de alguna actividad vedada. Eran las 3:15 y el ambiente aún olía al pan horneado en la merienda. Se acercó con sigilo, a sabiendas de estar invadiendo dominios de Sor Pascualina. Hurgó como lo haría un niño y descubrió a la noctámbula monja ocupada en tareas domésticas. Le iba a ordenar: retírese a dormir, cuando vio cómo desplegaba unas medias que él había usado la jornada anterior. Las estiraba con las dos manos y se las pasaba por el cuello como si fuese un fular. Joseph se conmocionó cuando la mujer, luego de arrugarlas, las olió como si el aroma de sus pies sudorosos fuese un elixir irresistible. ¿Qué le restaba? ¿Castigarla? Mientras Joseph dudaba, Pascualina repitió la escena con más intensidad, dejando escapar un gemido. Se sintió apetecido, ultrajado e indignado, y aún así no pudo controlar una suerte de endurecimiento. Avergonzado, decidió recluirse en su lecho hasta muy entrada la mañana. Solo durmió algunos minutos, ya que lo trastornaba la pesada carga de saberse deseado por alguien sin merecimientos. Sin embargo, tenía que enfrentar la situación que lo sobrecogía y tomar al toro por los cuernos, para lo cual la citó a su despacho en horas de la siesta. Thank you very much. And now I invite Professor Boland.
Thank you very much. I'll try to do justice to the Spanish text. Ratzinger gave a start, since he thought he was alone. Catching sight of the nun in the gloom, he had an intuition. Was there more than an invisible conspiracy brewing in all this darkness? On the other hand, of what possible relevance could another violation of his privacy by Sister Pascualina be? It's like recounting my secrets to a pet animal, he thought. And then a sudden fit of depression overcame him when he remembered the curse that her Mayan cousin, Ana Neglis, had laid upon him in his nightmare. "Good night, Your Eminence." She took her leave sheepishly, aware of the blunder she had just committed. Ratzinger had no energy left to respond. All he aspired to was a modicum of tranquility, to enjoy his own company. It took some minutes of meditation for him to forget the uncomfortable situation he had just endured, but eventually he experienced that soothing calm brought by the very early hours of the morning. It was time for the ritual of his long walks between the bedroom and the library, the two-way stations of a dogged and immutable itinerary. But that night, the dry air forced him to change his routine and to head to the service area to look for a dollop of honey. The kitchen was bisected by a ray of light streaming from a door that had not been shut properly, a clear sign of some forbidden activity taking place. It was 3:15, and the smell of bread baked for the afternoon snack still hung in the air. He entered stealthily, with the knowledge that he was invading Sister Pascualina's domain. Poking around like a mischievous child, he discovered the nun engaged in nocturnal domestic activities. He was about to order her, "It's time to go to bed," when he saw her unfolding a pair of socks he had worn the day before, stretching them between her hands and wrapping them around her neck like a foulard. Joseph was shocked when he saw the nun screw them up and then smelled them as if the aroma of his sweaty feet were an irresistible elixir. What should he do? Punish her? As Joseph hesitated, Pasqualina emitted a low moan and reenacted this scene even more passionately. Feeling wanted, violated, and indignant all at the same time, Joseph wasn't able to suppress a stiffening between his legs. Ashamed, he opted for the refuge of his bed, where he remained until late that morning. Troubled by the heavy burden of knowing he was the object of desire by somebody unworthy, he could only sleep for a few minutes. But realizing that he had to confront the intimidating situation, he took the bull by the horns and asked her to meet him in his office that very day at siesta time. Thank you.
Well, that concludes the formal proceedings. Can I invite you now to join us next door for a glass of wine, very kindly hosted by the Embassy of Paraguay. Esteban will be signing copies of his book, which will be available there. And can I finally again thank Eugenia and her colleagues at the Australian National Centre for Latin American Studies for organising this event. And thank you all very much for coming. Thank you.